I just want to introduce Jessica Fanzo from Johns Hopkins. She came in at the last moment to offer us some comments. She's a nutritionist, but one who works a lot in the sort of agri-food system space. So we're very much looking forward to your thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a really poor substitute for Shelley Sundberg, particularly because I can't fund Arena 3. Can't make those decisions. So this was fascinating run through of a really important project. I think we all know that diets now globally are considered suboptimal. They are major contributors to the disease burden. And the syndemic report that came out in the Lancet showed that malnutrition in all its forms is one of the top burdens of disease, more so than high blood pressure, tobacco smoke, raised blood glucose levels. So the diet piece is critically important. But what I think this arena shows is also that diets are incredibly inequitable. We're really in a world of haves and have-nots. And it's an interesting time to present this because there's been a real uptick in the debate around animal source foods, how animal source foods are produced, how much are consumed, and whether or not they align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Much of this debate sits at the global level, really focusing on high-income countries who, in some cases, are consuming too much. But what I think IRENA shows is that there's still huge swaths of the world's population that are not getting enough animal source foods, not getting enough high-quality foods, and animal source foods being one of these trigger points now in the global debate is really key. But I think we know that rural places, the poor, the geographically isolated, really struggle to get an adequate diet, particularly around animal source foods. So I think there needs to be more nuance in the debate, and I know IFPRI has been key in providing that nuance. So I'm left with lots of questions, and I hope we can talk about them. I know ARENA was meant to shed light on the research and policy agenda, but here was just some of my loose thoughts in all of their, coming from a very naive perspective. So clearly, infrastructure is really important in these rural places, and I think it goes beyond roads. So, what kind of high technology, high innovation can be taken to these low resource areas and bring innovation along the supply chain? And what would that look like? And who would do that? What kind of partnerships should there be with private sector or innovative platforms to do this and accelerate that? So that's one area. It's clearly there needs to be significant improvement in infrastructure and value chain development. I think it's really interesting that you can't look at commodities alone. You can't just look at fish in its isolation. You can't just look at dairy. I love the whole idea around the feed and the feed sector, which very much feeds into the animal source food productivity. So how do we grapple with this, particularly with the competition of land and land use, and what kind of alternative feeds can we be thinking about in these animal source foods to increase their productivity? I was really left with trying to understand the enabling environment. What should policies focus on? Is it subsidies? Is it trade? Is it just investing in value chains? And I think many of you have asked that in the conclusions. I was left with a few demand things. We know that changing food environments and markets are key, but we also know that in rural places, food environments really are changing, and they're changing quite rapidly. We're seeing more and more unhealthy processed packaged foods come into these rural places. We've all been to them. So I'd be really keen to see the market landscape and how you look at transition towards not only just the animal source foods, but also the unhealthy foods and the demand and supply of those in these more deeply rural places. Another thing I noticed is consumers, are driven by many of the same issues: taste, price, safety, eggs. Is there a taste issue? Why we see some of these differences? Around the eggs, are the scavenging systems? Can we can we amplify them to have more intensive type systems? On fish, is there a way to improve the status of fish among consumers? Why do they decline? Why are they less important as people get wealthier? What role does aquaculture play in ensuring that feed is affordable and more sustainable? On the dairy side, I just had an interesting question around lactose intolerance. A Lancet Commission report showed that about 2/3 of the world is lactose intolerant. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's somewhere between 77 and 100%. This gets into a whole nother realm of biology and the complications of utilization of these foods. So I was curious to know if there would be potentially some links there looking at integration with biologists and economists. And then my last two things were gender. You know, it wasn't really mentioned much, but the gender links to these commodities, as they commercialize, how does that change in household food intake? What are the dynamics around there from an economic perspective? And, you know, I'm left a little bit depressed, I have to say, Derek. I mean, how do you get these rural places to thrive? You know, and we have a growing urban population, and you know, someone's going to have to feed that urban population, but if rural people and places can't feed themselves, it becomes a really difficult conundrum. And so I was left a little bit saddened by seeing this around the poor food system environments, and how do we really tackle some of these broad issues around ensuring that particularly young children get access to animal source food. So I hope we can talk about a little bit of infrastructure, a little bit of policy, but the demand side going all the way to digestion would be some interesting food for thought as we get into the Q&A. Thank you.